Minnesota Public Radio's 800,000 plus audience all know and recognize the voice of this man, Gary Eichten, the award-winning host of NPR's Midday. But some of us here tonight remember Gary as this guy. Gary Eichten, class of 1969. He came to St. John's by way of Mankato, where he had been born and raised, and is a graduate of Mankato Loyola High School. In his 4 years at St. John's, Gary went from a speech and communications major in his first year to graduation with a humanities major in his fourth year. Along the way, he sampled more than enough coursework in political science, philosophy, history, and other disciplines to make him something of a poster child for a broadly based, interdisciplinary liberal arts education. A footnote on his favorite professors. Although fond of poli-sci Professor Joe Ferry, Gary still has some rather mixed feelings about Ferry's habit of scheduling his classes on Saturday mornings. Gary also dabbled in the theater, playing the male lead in The Ladies Not for Burning, and he also served on the Student Activities Board, where, to judge by this photo, he was, cigarette in hand, already working on the Edward R. Murrow look. Shortly after Father Coleman Barry and Bill Kling in 1967 hatched the idea for a public radio station, KSGR-FM, at St. John's, Gary was offered a student job at the station. At first, he hesitated. After he weighed the merits of his other job offer, a job in the refectory, our cafeteria, he decided to take a chance and joined KSGR as a student announcer, and thus became one of a handful of Johnnies who were there at the creation of what would become Minnesota Public Radio. When the operation moved to its St. Paul headquarters, Gary went along. In his career, he served as station manager, news director, and for 20 years, the host of Midday. In his first year at St. John's, on the 4th floor of Bennett Hall, Gary first met this guy, Nick Hayes, also a member of the class of 69, whom you today might recognize as this guy. Sometime back in the 1980s, Gary and I reconnected when he brought me on NPR as an occasional guest, first on All Things Considered, and then giving me about a 20-year run as a frequent guest on Midday. On Gary's show, we have talked about reform and revolutions in Eastern Europe, the fall of the Soviet Union, genocide in the Balkans, post-communist dictatorships, wars around the world. Often, I was calling in and speaking from some of the world's worst telephone systems in Russia and Eastern Europe. But we've always had time for a bit of humor, as was evident in this show in 2007, on the 50th anniversary of the launching of Sputnik. We did this one as a phone-in from my office at St. John's.
Those beeps may not sound like much today, but 50 years ago they scared the bejesus out of Americans. 50 years ago today, on Friday, October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the world's first satellite. The world learned a new word that day, Sputnik. And also with us from Collegeville is historian and Russian expert Nick Hayes. Nick is a professor of history and holds the university chair in critical thinking at St. John's University. Now, Nick Hayes, as far as I know, you're not a scientist of any note.
No, I don't claim that, Gary.
Did you go out and look in the sky for the Sputnik?
Oh, did I ever, Gary? I mean, first of all, you just replayed for me the beep that made me into a 10-year-old insomniac at that time. I can remember vividly in South Minneapolis, my brothers and I looking up at the skies, and I have to confess, I don't think we ever really saw it, but we kind of pretended maybe a lot of distant airplane lights were satellites. But, oh, yes, I was quite preoccupied with it, and it was a major issue in my grade school during that time. We, in fact, increased our atomic bomb air raid drills in my grade school in reaction to it. So.
But Gary had a lot of other and better talent from St. John's and St. Ben's to draw upon. Some of his most memorable programs featured his conversations with St. John's most famous alumni, the former senator, presidential candidate, and writer, Eugene McCarthy. In this exchange from Midday, Gary prompted McCarthy into a few remarks on his larger-than-life heroic image.
And good afternoon. Welcome back to Midday on Minnesota Public Radio News. I'm Gary Eichten.
I just want to thank Eugene McCarthy. I don't know that anyone else has. If he never did anything else in his life, the fact that he shortened and helped to stop the Vietnamese conflict and saved thousands of Vietnamese and our men's lives is forever to his credit.
Well, thank you very much.
Are you comfortable being called a hero?
Well, I don't know. I didn't think I was one. I think I was acting not just in my own capacity, but as any member of the Senate should have acted. That it was a projection of the Senate constitutional responsibility, and those of us against the war had tried to dissuade Johnston, and after he was reelected, and there was no response.
Another frequent midday guest and distinguished alumni is former Senator Dave Durenberger, who in recent years has guided midday audiences through the complexities of health care reform and legislation.
To help us get ready for the President's remarks, to put them in some context, we've been joined by former Minnesota Republican Senator Dave Durenberger, who was known as Senator Healthcare during his years in Washington. Senator Durenberger chaired the Senate Health Subcommittee and authored or co-authored most of the Medicare, Medicaid, health insurance, and health reform legislation that Congress took up back in the 80s and early 90s.
They were telling us they could save 1.7 trillion or something like that. So I don't really get it. I've never known the AMA to represent a lot of the kinds of doctors that I know in Minnesota, and so I can't say to you that, honestly, that there's a consensus on universal coverage.
Another familiar voice on Midday has been history professor Richard Bohr. He also has a long history of working with Gary that goes back to All Things Considered in the early 1980s and regular appearances on Midday from its first days on the air to the present. Invariably, when issues of China and its relationship with the United States come up, Gary turns to Richard for his insights, as in this program on President Obama's trip to China.
Richard Bohr is the Director of Asian Studies at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict, former president of the Midwest China Center, and former executive director of the Minnesota World Trade Office. Richard Bohr, get acquainted time or substantive meetings on the agenda?
It is substantive, Gary, and I can't imagine a finer representative of the United States going to these series of meetings and meeting with our partners and friends in Asia than Barack Obama.
In the last few years, we've seen a couple of new academic stars on public radio whom Gary has cultivated on Midday. One is, of course, Professor of History Annette Atkins, the Dean of Minnesota Historians, and a frequent guest on Midday when Gary is looking for insights into our Minnesota past, as in this exchange between Gary and Annette on the 150th anniversary of Minnesota statehood.
Joining us here in the studio is Annette Atkins, who teaches Minnesota history at St. John's University in Collegeville and the College of St. Benedict in St. Joseph. She has a new book out about the history of the state titled Creating Minnesota. Annette, if I may start with you, if you would take us back to 1858, who was living here?
I think I'd go actually to 1850 rather than 1858. 1850 was the first year that there was a census of any kind seriously taken. And partly I'm saying that because in 1850 there were about 6,000 non-Indians, which is how the Federal Census Bureau categorized Indians and non-Indians. And by 1857 there were 150,000.
The other rising star on Midday is Professor and Chair of Economics, Louis Johnston. He has emerged as Midday's key voice in tracking the Great Recession we are in. Louis likes to recall his first time on Midday. I still remember, he says, being asked to appear on Midday for the first time in 2004. It was like getting called up to the big leagues. I'd been on other programs, but Midday was, and is, the Yankees. Here Louis reflects on the economics and politics of budget crises.
And Louis Johnston is with us today here in our St. Paul studios rather than our studios in Collegeville. Louis is the chair of the Department of Economics at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict. He's a co-author of an economics textbook with Robert Frank and Federal Reserve Board Chairman Ben Bernanke. Louis Johnston, if you had to choose, which would do more damage, deep spending cuts or an increase in taxes on the wealthiest?
One of the things you see when you look at the data is that the size of state government tends to vary with the business cycle. So when times get tough, the size of state government relative to the size of the rest of the economy grows. It shrinks when the economy is booming. And so, in a sense, we have to think about why we have government. as much as what the size of it is. And I would argue one of the reasons we have government is to help out those who can't help themselves in times of difficulty.
Looking back over 2 decades of working with Gary, Richard Bohr says, Gary has been a great teacher for Minnesota. Louis Johnston compares Gary to one of his favorite professors. When asked why he wrote books, the professor answered that his books were the written record of his search for answers to his question. That's what Gary and Midday are all about, Louis says. Gary is endlessly curious about the world, and Midday is the audio result of Gary's search for answers and understanding. Recently, we've been delighted to have Gary back on our campuses. Welcome home. And Gary, you must know that back in Collegeville and St. Joseph, you make us proud.
Thank you, Nick Hayes.
Well, thank everyone for coming. We should say that that tape you've seen, and I'm getting a little sound interference here, was produced for a program we held at NPR to kind of celebrate Gary's career when, at the time, shortly after he announced his retirement from Midday. And it was originally shown to primarily an NPR St. John's alumni gathering. Now, for this evening, I am not going to read from my notes. I thought I would take a few minutes maybe to prompt Gary with a few questions and try in the course of a conversation to move him along through the chapters of his career from St. John's to the present. At the same time, please, I'll stop to invite questions from the audience, different perspectives, to try to make this as lively as a conversation as we can. But let's begin at the very beginning, and this is a question that I've brought up to Gary before, frankly. And I bring it up again because I'm looking out. There are many young people in the audience, students who are thinking career choices ahead, wondering what if, roads not taken, and so on. And to me, if you paid attention to this, the real critical question in Gary's career, the real what if, is, should you have stayed working in the refectory, Gary? I mean, just think of it. You could have gone into collegiate food service.
Absolutely.
Now,
well, and obviously there's still a demand. I ate at the refectory last evening, and there's a conveyor belt. When you're done eating, you put the tray on there, and off it goes. And at the end of the belt, of course, there's a window, and a hand reached out. That was me. I could, people are always going to eat. And as long as I didn't slow down too much, I think I could have been employed forever. I wouldn't have had to retire.
Now, I've done a little bit of research on this question for Gary, because he happened to have, a year ago told me something, and I realized something he had in common with my brother Tom, who was also a student at St. John's at that time. They both had a crush on a certain young woman who worked in the refectory, right?
Yes.
I did call my brother Tom today to get her name, but he couldn't remember. He just remembered a nickname, which, forgive me, I can't share with you. But here we are, Gary. We're talking about what now. This is a bit awkward, but we're getting close to St. Valentine's Day. You could be honest.
Love is in the air.
Right. I mean, your lovely wife, Joanne, couldn't make it tonight. But you ever think of that? You could have stayed there. The two of you could have had this career.
It would have never worked out because her father also worked in the back room there. And he was an old-fashioned German farmer, very protective of his daughter, and very unhappy with the attentions that were showered on her by us young punks.
I'm sure he noticed my brother. Well, for the audience, as the slideshow mentioned, Gary grew up in Mankato, and his first job was with a radio station in New Ulm. Mm-hmm. Now, once again, looking at the faces of students here, I assume your career choices, your job searches, how you approach employment is extremely important, especially that first job. Now, Gary can perhaps share with you one secret he learned from his first job application and resume. That is, be sure to lie about your experiences on the resume, right, Gary?
Absolutely.
If you could elaborate.
Absolutely. I needed a job, and I had never, we were all in that circumstance. And I needed to make some money so I could come back to St. John's for a second year, and couldn't find a job at the old concrete plant where I was working, so I ended up in New Ulm applying for a job at the radio station. Now, I knew they were fairly desperate anyway, but I knew they weren't so desperate as to hire somebody who had never been in a radio station. So you got to lie, don't you? I understand it's not a Benedictine value, but I said, I've got a year's experience up at college. I've done a year's worth of radio up there. Of course, I hadn't, but they hired me, and they said, look, why don't you start the next day, or whatever, and come on in. We'll have you do the 1 o'clock afternoon program. Now, this was, the lowest listening period of time, so it was a good choice given everything else. But then the guy said, look, come on in an hour early during the noon hour, and you can watch the old veteran guy there and get a sense of how everything works. I suppose the old veteran guy was probably 25. I don't know. Looked grizzly to me. Anyway, so I come in the next day, and I'm a little nervous, frankly, but I think, well, okay, I can read pretty well, and I know a little bit about music. I think I can get through this. But there's this guy, and he's sitting behind the control board, running his own, and he's got his control board there that controls all the microphone volumes and stuff, and he's got a turntable here, which he's queuing up one-handed, and he's got what used to be called a cartridge machine, which was a fancy tape machine. He had that going over here. Then he had another deal going up here, and he's doing all of this, and of course he's reading copy all simultaneously. And I thought to myself, Gary, you have made a horrible mistake. You are about to make a complete fool of yourself. You can't do any one of those things. And now, in an hour, you're going to do all of them. Well, I couldn't do all of them, but, I did enough to get by, and so it worked out. By the end of the summer, I actually knew how to do all that stuff.
Well, so to continue on with your radio career, we'll come back to your studies at St. John's. So it's 1967, your sophomore year, the end of your sophomore year. Mm-hmm. You had to make the big choice between the refectory,
right,
and an offer.
It's April Fool's Day.
Right. And so, tell us a little bit about what it was like, what the station was like when you first started.
Well, there was a general manager, Bill Kling, who, by the way, parenthetically, is a genius and about whom a book should be written because he invented public radio in America. Anyway, that's my commercial. So he was there, and we had a full-time engineer and then a bunch of students. And that was the whole deal. The vision, St. John's vision was to develop a radio station which could share world culture with the surrounding community, encourage civic engagement. It was a noble vision. Fortunately, the community bought into it. Unfortunately, there wasn't anybody to actually carry out the mission. We were pretty short-staffed. We had no listeners, no money, no experience. But, we stumbled from day to day, week to week. And the one thing about it, Nick, that, and I've talked to a few people about this, the one thing that was constant from the very beginning, we weren't even the best radio station on the campus. KSJU, which was the student station at the time, was a much better radio station. So we weren't even the best one. But the one constant was
this insistence that we were going to be the best radio station in America. Now, this was so foolish. You know, it was lunacy. But that was always there as not the unstated goal, it was the stated goal. And if you did something pretty good, you know, you'd get a little pat on the head, and the next thing you would hear is, so what are you going to do for me tomorrow? You got to do better tomorrow. Whatever it was, in every area. You know, sometimes that got to be a little tiring. You'd like to just kind of sit back and rest on your laurels. That wasn't going to happen, never has happened, and as far as I know, as of a year ago, never did happen. I mean, and it's that kind of intense commitment to excellence which turned that little goofy radio station into what NPR is today.
You know, Gary, I was thinking today, we take for granted NPR. I guess it's Pledge Week, so it was on my mind a lot. But
1-800-227-2811.
Because I'm into what-ifs in history, by the way, these days. I do a lot of what-if questions. It suddenly occurred to me, have you ever speculated, what if public radio had not started here at that time? What if there had not been an NPR? What would the radio environment here look like, or media environment?
Well, I think we'd all be poor. I know I would. My own personal story would, who knows where I'd ended up. But I think we'd all be poor because I think it's a good service in and of itself, Minnesota Public Radio, and I think it has a great spillover effect, has had over the years, on other media, challenging them. I mean, you know, if a bunch of kids can, untrained kids can do all this stuff, well, big-time professionals ought to be able to. If kind of a highbrow, hoity-toity radio station can generate that much enthusiasm among listeners, maybe some of the other stations could follow that model a little bit. I think it would be, we would all be poor in terms, if for no other reason, in terms of pure news and information coverage. There isn't anything like Minnesota Public Radio's news coverage. It's just a lot better than anybody else is offering in our area.
Yeah, could I just interrupt?
Yes, sir.
Say something about the original range of this station and about Coleman's and Bill's idea that we're going to link up with other colleges.
Right. There was you know, even when it went on the air, KSJR was a fairly powerful technical station, but it could only go so far. Father Coleman Berry, I think especially, had this vision of connecting with all the private colleges around the region and building this network. And so they set about doing, I think the third station was in Moorhead, I believe, and then off it went, in Worthington, Duluth, Rochester, Decorah, you know, knitting together this network of stations which got a lot of central programming, eventually out of St. Paul, but which always was predicated on the notion of presenting the stories, the music, the culture of a particular region to the whole region, to the whole state. It was a unique vision, something that, again, was not, nobody else was trying to do anything like that. It's a good thing they went that direction, because no one area, including the Twin Cities, could have supported what Minnesota Public Radio has become. There just isn't enough money, there's not enough interest, there aren't enough people. But if you take an entire state, an entire region, and have them pitching in to the common good, it works.
Let me invite, if there are other questions from the audience, please. Rita?
How was that beginning funded? Was it members? Was it?
Well, initially, all the money came from St. John's, bless their heart. And then there were a few wealthier donors who fortunately stepped up and provided some money. St. John's, again, I mean, it's like a child, you know. You get the kid started, and at some point they realized the only way that this operation was going to survive long term was if we let it go. We have to turn it over to a private, nonprofit board, broaden the base of support, of interest, and I mean, I don't say this just because we're here at St. John's. I mean, we would never have been created, and we never would have survived without their wise decision making. Eventually, you know, we started to tap individual people for contributions. And I always thought that was a goofy idea. I mean, first time Kling talked about that, I said, huh? Why would anybody in the world pay to listen to a radio station after they've already listened to the station? So you put the program on, they've listened to the program, and then at some point in the distant future, you're going to come around and, you know, tap them for some money. Nobody else was doing that. That was another goofy idea. But it became a national model. Another part of the Kling genius. I mean, I don't think he invented the notion, but he sure perfected it.
What about your education, Gary? You did not study journalism, maybe a few comm courses, right? You would graduate in humanities. Mm-hmm. How did a basic liberal arts background, what really shaped your mind? What sorts of courses do you think ultimately became part of the voice you brought to the air? What kind of advice would you give to students who might think of doing the same?
I think, first of all, I have a bias here. I'll be flat honest about it. If I had gone to J school, say at the U of M, which I really wanted to do, chickened out because the school was too big. Fortunately, I was, you know, came up here and fell into a career. So I probably would look at this differently if I had gone the more traditional route. But I just got a broad liberal arts education at St. John's. Never stepped foot in a journalism class, anything to do with radio and TV, didn't learn any of that. I did have a couple of speech classes. That's as close as I ever got to anything. And I think, as it turns out, it was the perfect preparation for doing radio news programs. The perfect preparation. Why do I say that? Because any reasonably decent, proficient radio, TV guy could teach any of you in this room how to do radio and TV stuff, the mechanics of it, in a couple of weeks, maybe a month. But then the question is, what's in your head? So you know how to, okay, you know how to push the buttons and you know, kind of what the routine is. All right, what's in your brain? What have you learned about life? What have you learned about society, politics, blah, blah, blah? Well, you get a great liberal arts education from St. John's, and you've got a pretty good base to work with. You actually know stuff. And at least you hope you do. And so I'm a big believer in and I would think that would apply to almost every career, wouldn't it? Forget about radio and TV. I would think that would apply to almost everything. Maybe if you had a real narrow deal, like you were going to be, like a nuclear physicist, maybe you wouldn't have to know so much about Chaucer. But I don't know, maybe you do.
It's useful. Any other thoughts, questions? Let me turn a few reflections, my own observations about listening to Gary's career, I guess, more than seeing it. First of all, I've always been attracted and impressed by the voice you bring to public radio. I mentioned this earlier tonight at dinner, but it's so, especially if we go back 10, 20 years, to me it's so unlike kind of the pompousness of public radio voices. For the audience, many here in the audience would not remember one of the original public radio employees, Art Hain, who did mainly the classical music stuff here and that. And he was the classical music voice for years and years and years. And Hayne did have this kind of heavy, pompous voice, so much so, as I was telling Gary earlier, I had a friend from Chicago who used to visit St. John's in the 60s who had become a stand-up comedian. And this friend's most popular routine was an imitation of that FM voice from Art Hayne. But to get back to the real point, Gary doesn't have any of that in there. When I listen to you, first of all, you speak in this kind of, well, Mankato, Minnesota idiot. You know, you think, you listen, you agree, there's a heck of a guy, you know, by golly. But it's very deceptive because behind that voice, especially Lewis and I could comment on this, you realize very quickly this is a very smart man you're talking to. The folksiness is very deceptive. But there's one part of your presentation that has always befuddled me. And I'm sure you've never done this with Louis Johnston or Richard Bohr. But as I'm doing right now, often I go on too much. And Gary would throw out a question, and suddenly I realized, whatever, I've used up the whole 5-7-minute segment. And Gary's response to many of my comments was very terse. He would listen and say, That's all.
Actually, I had just woken up.
Yes. I deserve that. I deserve that. Yeah. Well, let's talk about politics. With all of the tributes that came to Gary a year ago, and I'm sure you'll hear this from Governor Dayton when he's here, and I've heard it from many political leaders in the state. Nobody knows Gary's politics. I can name politicians who say, well, Nick, you know him. I mean, what's this real politics? If you have followed Gary on the radio, you'll discover that, like Jesse Ventura, thinks Gary's in his camp, that thinks highly of Gary. Palenti liked Gary. Mark Dayton likes Gary. You can go on the whole list. But he has consistently spoken in utter neutrality and been able to draw out a whole variety of diverse political opinions. So how do you do that, Gary? I mean, isn't there, at a certain point in time, don't you want to say, oh, wait a minute? I mean, has there ever been moments when you have thought of crossing the line?
Yes.
And did you?
No. I don't think I have. I tried not to. No, you know, because the thing is, and we've talked about this before, you know, people don't tune in to hear what Gary Eichten thinks about the governor's $500 property tax rebate. For Pete's sake, you know. What they want to hear is the governor explain why he's proposing a $500 property tax rebate, what he hopes to accomplish, answer critics who say it's a goofy idea. You know, that's why people tune in, not to hear me. And so whether I agree with these people, whether I disagree with the people, whether I don't care one way or the other, is really, I always thought, just doesn't matter, frankly. And so unless somebody was just flat out lying, there was no reason to get in the way of what was going on. You know, sometimes people, the guests would bob and weave, you know, Louis Johnston, for example. You'd ask him a straight question, and all you'd get is, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, you know, this kind of nonsense. But excluding guests like that, there was no reason to inject myself in those conversations.
But one more follow-up, and then Jim. But what do you think of a Bill Moyers, for example? It's clear we know what Moyers' politics are. You can think of many other voices in journalism where you know. What's their place as compared to your place in the media?
Well, obviously, I mean, you know, it's real popular, and you go on, you know, the other side of the fence, Limbaugh and people like that. You know, they have their place, I guess. It's not my style. It's nothing I'm particularly interested in. I mean, if you think of it this way. And people really get riled up if I said, you know, Governor, that's a ridiculous idea. All right. Now, if you like the governor's plan, whatever it was, everything I would say after that would somehow be filtered through that lens, that this guy doesn't like the governor, and blah, 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 blah. Nobody could, you just can't listen to somebody without putting everything that follows into that little box. So it's better to stay out of the box, I think. And these other folks have their place. I just hope, without getting too preachy about it, I hope that we all have the good sense to recognize who these folks are, what they're saying, why they're saying what they're saying, and put it in a context. I had a woman call me years ago who was kind of a distant relative, actually a relative of my wife's, and she was in her cups that day. I don't think that was important to the story. Maybe it was. Anyway, she was chatting away, and she said, somehow we got on the fact I was on the radio and what I do. And she says, well, what did you, let's say, I don't know what the story was. Let's say it's a tax increase. What do you think about that tax increase? And I said, well, I'm not going to say anything about it because I have to deal with that. She said, what do you mean? What do you mean? I said, well, it's just not proper. I'm just not going to talk about it. She said, well, Rush does. That's why I get all my news from Rush Limbaugh. Well, I guess that's okay, but it's not my style.
Jim?
Well, this is really kind of a follow-up on this same issue that both, not only Rush, but lots of cable television and talk radio is exactly the opposite of your style, which is to put the
right.
Bill O'Reilly or Limbaugh at the center of it,
right.
and the guest not even be able to use the word in edgewise. And what disturbs me is that people seem to like that. I mean,
oh yes.
Described seem to like that. So what does that say? That there seem to be so many people out there that are willing to listen and feed the pocketbooks of people who put themselves at the center rather than letting the guests actually talk.
Well, I think it's very discouraging. On the other hand, the other way to look at it is that Minnesota Public Radio has built the most successful public radio system in the nation on the opposite premise. And frankly, we had pretty good success even just on the midday program with audience numbers, all that stuff. I'm not saying that I was ever as popular as Rush Limbaugh. That's not what I'm saying. But we did okay. We did all right. And some people would say, boy, that's really boring. And maybe it is a little bit, but that's not a bad thing. Boring is not bad.
I'm so glad you said that.
If it's kind of interesting boring.
That's what I've asked for. Express maybe Jim's idea in a different way. Do you think that style can survive? Because even public radio now is becoming driven by who the host is.
Well, let's see, yes. Well, see, I think they're going, to the extent they're doing that, they're going down the wrong path. I hope it does, because we're going to be, and again, not to be too preachy about this, but we are going to be in deep trouble if that isn't available, that approach to the news and to information isn't available at least someplace where people can turn and say, well, let's at least get the basic factual information out in an unbiased, fair way, and then I can go about my business and feed my prejudices, But if that central operating principle is gone, then we got trouble.
Hillary? You're very modestly not telling us how much work goes into asking intelligent questions.
Well, the days where I hate to talk about that, actually, Hillary, because it sounds like I'm trying to be a martyr. And I had a great job. I really had fun doing this work. But to do a successful, good interview, it seemed to me you really did have to work at it. I started at 3 in the morning, finished about 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, went to bed, got up and started the next day. And almost all of that, only 2 hours of that was actually on the air. All the rest of the time was spent, for the most part, researching. There were two types of research, kind of a general knowledge base that you had to maintain, because you never knew what was going to pop up in the news out of the blue. All of a sudden, you get a call, oh my goodness, Yeltsin has been thrown out of office in Russia, and we got a new guy in, and in about an hour you're going to, Gary, do a show about Russian politics. That's when you call Nick Hayes. But at any rate, you got to know about this stuff in a general kind of way. All right, most of the time that's not an issue. What really is an issue is you've got a guest lined up for the next day. Lewis is going to be on the next day. We're going to talk economics. I know that. What I don't know is what's going on in terms of inflation. What the latest thinking is on budget issues. It's like being in college. You've got read your books every day, and then you've got your pop quiz. So you got to bone up and stuff your head full of stuff for your pop quiz. You get done with the quiz, you flush that out because tomorrow you've got another one on a different subject. And that's really and when you go into the interview then, if you've done your research, you shouldn't be surprised by much of what happens in that interview. If I ask you a question, I should have a pretty good idea what your answer is going to be. And if it is really a surprising answer, well, then we've got a hell of an interview. No, seriously. That's when it really catches fire because, wow, this is all new information. And then you can probe and find out more about that. So yeah, it takes, if you do it well and do it right, it takes a lot of work.
If I may follow up, I'm sure Lewis could make the same point. As someone who's done a lot of interviews with other, radio or TV programs, it is obvious when you come on Gary's show that the research and background is there. He knows what questions to ask. To be honest, on some other programs, I sometimes think I have to promise I won't use any big words or anything. But it's really amazing. And because it can be on such short notice. One thing, I'm looking around also for questions, one thing I'd like to draw everybody's attention to about Gary and his art of conversation. I have learned over the years that the mark of a really good journalist is a gift I don't have. That is, they're genuinely interested in everybody. That, for me, if I'm ever doing interviews, I always kind of end up like the old John Cleese, host of the Monty Python news show, where halfway in the interview I start to shout, "Oh, would you shut up? You're so boring." But I have noticed this with Gary and another person who's well known to the community here, Fred DeSam Lazaro. It's just, you seem genuinely interested. With the exception, I noticed that you mentioned I put you to sleep once in a while.
Frequently, actually. But everybody needs their rest.
But how do you maintain that interest? Over such a diverse group of people.
Well, because I think it's a diverse group of people. I think that's a big part of it. I think everybody, almost everybody, I think everybody has an interesting story to tell about something or other. The question is trying to figure out what that something might be and then honing in on that and having them tell a story in a way that's interesting to listen to. And if you just took 10 people off the street, it'd be kind of hard to do that because people aren't accustomed to talking into microphones and so on and so forth. But these are the people I talk to, for the most part, public officials and, people who are used to being in the public sphere. So the idea of being interviewed isn't so shocking to them and so frightening. They all, you can't think about it this way. Just in terms of politicians, and this applies elsewhere too, but just in terms of politicians, if you have to go out to make for your living and ask people to support you, well, you have to have some personality. You have to be somewhat engaging, you know, and presumably you have to know a little something about something. And my job as an interviewer would be to find out what that is, and then I learned something. I had one of the great jobs of all time. I learned something new every day, and I don't know. I don't think everybody can say that, but I could because I did. I learned something every day, except when Nick was on.
What was your worst experience? Have you ever had, I think it was Terry Gross on Fresh Air once had this notorious interview, was with Gene Simmons, right, of Kiss, where the guy was just vulgar, sexually insulting, and in the middle of the show she finally said, "I won't take this anymore," and walked off the air. Whoever was the assistant producer came in and winged it for 30 minutes. I don't recall you've had anything like that, but seriously, what was the worst interview experience you've ever had?
Well, there are two that come to mind. One, there was a guy on who will remain nameless, but it was a sensitive subject, had to do with U.S. Troop behavior in Iraq, and he was, you know, against the war and stuff. And that's fine, but he was on the air just blatantly lying about things, and you know, that's it, and shut him off, and I don't know what we did the rest of the hour, but you can't put up with that stuff. But so I don't know if that was an interview. That was just a program. I think that the toughest interview had to do with a movie star. I didn't do a lot of movie star interviews. In fact, this may be the only movie star interview I did for a lot of reasons. Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda. I have to put this in some context. We were in the middle of renovating the building at the time, and there were ghastly fumes from time to time from the construction process building up and it was really, I mean, it was really overwhelming. Smelled terrible, and it was, you know, you're kind of bobbing and weaving and lightheaded. And we were in this little tiny studio, and so that made it more difficult. She had a lot of perfume on, I think, and it was so she came in, and it was pretty clear she didn't want to be there. And it was pretty clear that she just really disliked me. I mean, I don't know. She didn't like me at all. You know, sometimes there are people you just don't hit it off with, right? And I didn't like her very much. So we had quite an hour together. You know, interestingly enough, so I announced that I'm retiring, and I'm at the state fair, and people are so kind. You know, they're coming up and, "Oh, Gary, you're such a, you know, Mother Teresa," you know. and this one gal comes up, and I can't remember if she announced that she was some kind of distant relative of mine or just a fan. It doesn't matter. But she said, "You know, I've been listening all these years, and I just love your interviews. They're so great. You know, but there's one that I love best of all, and that was your interview with Jane Fonda." She said, "You two were on the same wavelength. You were so close." Well, yeah, right.
Well, let's try a few political questions. Let's try it this way. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, looking at a list of all of the politicians you've interviewed, how would you rate them? Number 1, did they answer your question? And 2, let us say the honesty with which they answered the question. Can we try that?
All right.
We'll make it easy. We'll start with our distinguished alumni, Senators McCarthy and Dave Durenberger.
Both were and are forthright, and you know, Senator McCarthy was sometimes, it was hard to get him to answer a question sometimes, because he was at heart a poet, and he was just a lot smarter than I was, you know, smarter than most people. So sometimes, you know, you would ask him what appeared to be a fairly straight-ahead question in the tape, you know, how do you feel like, what's it feel like to be a hero? Thought of as a hero. God, I don't know what he said, but it had nothing to do with being a hero. it was sometimes a little hard to follow, but he wasn't being disingenuous. He wasn't being, trying to shade the truth. He wasn't, he just was smarter than everybody else. Senator Durenberger, he has kind of the same problem. Again, very forthright and everything, but he'd get, especially when you talk to him about health care stuff, and he gets into this, descriptive mode of trying to explain to a dummy like me how some obtuse health care provision works. I don't know what he's talking about, and so you try to, but certainly not, no dissembling whatsoever.
Well, let's try a few governors. Arne Carlson.
Well, he was, again, always willing to answer the questions. Oh, he'd get mad, he'd get kind of irritated once in a while when he was in office. He was he was a forthright guy. He was prickly, a little prickly, but he, he was always real honest. Yeah.
Tim Pawlenty.
He was always willing to answer questions. No question about that. I think in the I think there were two, and please don't quote me on this, because I may end up having to do a program with him again. And I'm serious. But I think there were two Governor Pawlenty's. There was a first-term Governor Pawlenty and a second-term Governor Pawlenty. And I think the first-term Governor Pawlenty was far more outspoken, forthright. Second-term Governor Pawlenty was very much concerned with his, building a national base, national following, establishing his credentials on the national stage, and as a consequence, sometimes, would say things that you'd think, well, that's not quite right. But.
We'll skip Mark Dayton because we can all judge that Wednesday night, I guess. But of course, your biggest fan, Jesse Ventura.
Well, he never ducked any questions that I can think of, I don't. No, I can't think of any occasion when he even tried to shade the truth. He just didn't give a damn, frankly. and if you didn't like what he had to say, well, he didn't care. He was not in the business of trying to persuade you to his point of view. His rhetorical skills maybe left a little bit to be desired. He was a pretty straight ahead character, and a dangerous person because he was so big. Does everybody know that Governor Ventura was a professional wrestler? Everybody know that? And he's big. Was a giant guy. He's shrunk quite a bit now. You see him, and he looks kind of scrawny by comparison. But at the time, he had bulked up, and of course he had I had liked the governor. But he was really a massive guy, and he's not what you'd call a typical public radio listener. And so it was always a little, especially in the earliest days, it was always a little dicey as to what's going to happen when he'd come in the studio. And you could see he'd get kind of disturbed, and he'd start to rock in his chair when he'd get mad. And then his head would I don't know that it got bigger. I don't think the head could actually get bigger, but it would turn kind of red. And because he didn't have any hair or anything, the whole deal was red. And he would kind of loom up in his chair. And, I mean, Lord, if all he'd have to do was reach over and, put the headlock on me, I'd be a goner. So you always had to be careful with. But he never dodged any questions that I know of.
Well, let me end, maybe, with two final questions and thoughts, and still looking for a question from the audience. Is there any one story, one interview, I'll come to you in just a sec, that a a program that you're especially proud of, that someday, let us say, you want your grandchildren to hear? Any one particular thing?
Yeah, actually there are several, but I think it's not even a program, and I don't know that it exists on tape even. I hope it does somewhere, but the day that Senator Wellstone's plane crashed, this is an example of how it is that you actually need to be prepared for things that you never expected to have to deal with. We were in the middle of midday speech. It was about 12:20 in the afternoon. We were actually going to go up to Duluth, Sarah Meyer, my producer, and I, that afternoon, right after the show was over, to moderate a debate between Senator Wellstone and Norm Coleman, future Senator Coleman. And so we were, all packed, ready to go. And all of a sudden, the first inklings come in that there is a problem. And I don't remember exactly what happened. I think we learned that there was a delay or there was a plane crash. Something had happened near Evelyn. What it's all about. And pretty quickly, it became clear that there was a very important story here. But what the story was, weren't sure. And you don't want to go on the air and say, the U.S. Senator from Minnesota has been killed, because, of course, there's no word that he was even on a plane. And you certainly don't want to put people in the grave before their time. This is the last thing you want to do. But it was also clear we couldn't just sit there and continue to play this pre-recorded speech. Something had to be done. And so it fell to me, because it was during my shift, to go on the air and start talking and try to explain to people what the situation was, what we knew, which was very little, what we didn't know, which was quite a bit, and without speculating on what might have happened, speculate on what this might mean and what might be going on here. And that went on, as the afternoon rolled on, more and more information became clear, what had happened. There was mourning involved. There was necessary speculation about what the hell happens next in terms of the Senate seat, because it was a real important seat. Understand, the entire control of the U.S. Senate hung in the balance. This was not just like a Minnesota deal. As the afternoon went on and on, you had to keep people up to date, informed, but in basically a non-emotional way. It was hard to do, but by 5 o'clock, it was time for me to leave, and I think I did my job that day.
Nick, did I see your hand? Come on.
Gary, I'm just curious what your style of research is. Obviously, reading a lot of newspapers, I suppose.
Yeah.
You spend a lot of time in the day holed up in the dark corner of the library?
Mostly in the dark corner of my living room in the mornings, early in the mornings. And of course, it was really nice once computers came on board full speed. The last, 10 years, certainly the last 5 years, not 10 years, research became much easier. I mean, a couple of clicks, keystrokes, and you've got the world in front of you in terms of everything you ever wanted to know about pineapple production in, Hawaii, which would have taken a lot of labor to come up with previously. So you could do that very quickly. The one drawback to that, of course, is you can't always be sure of the accuracy of the information, and so you have to be a little more wary about the stuff you find on some blog as opposed to what you might find in the New York Times. But the research actually was much easier to do. But then, once you collect all this stuff, you got to wade through it and read it, and hopefully understand some of it.
Did I see? I think one more question.
Sure. So I think a lot of us here appreciate our liberal arts education, and that's one of the reasons we came
right?
We're all familiar with that question or related. So how did you transition from that liberal arts education into your career? I mean, obviously having the news radio here was a nice stepping stone, but how did you know that that career choice was what was right for you? Because it wasn't a direct path.
It's an excellent question, and I didn't have to make that choice. I mean, it just sort of was made for me. Once I had the job, what the heck? I had a job. Might as well keep doing the job, you know. And 40 years later, you realize, well, that turned out pretty well. But but I understand exactly. You know, that's why I thank the Lord. St. John started this radio station, because I don't know. I would have been in the same boat. There I sit with my humanities degree. I've not yet seen any ads, classified ads, calling for a humanities major.
You should see them for Russian historians, Gary. They're just pages and pages of it.
So it's tough, but I think it's an act of faith in a way. You know, I mean, no matter what, if you can get your foot in the door and get a leg up, get started, you're going to outshine the other folks because you know all this stuff. I know it sounds like hooey, but I got no dog in this fight here. It's true. You actually will. I mean, you know, Will up here, he came out and did. He was one of the Eichten Fellows last summer, and you know, he knew a little bit about radio when he came in, so we didn't have to teach him too much about that. But the main thing was he's got a brain in his head. He knows a lot about a lot of stuff, and that makes all the difference. And I gotta believe that's true in every profession. You know, it doesn't take all that long to learn the mechanics of a job, but you've got to bring some soul to it, you know, and some knowledge.
I think we have one. Let's take one last question here.
Thank you. I recently read a book for a class called The Narcissism Epidemic, which describes the narcissistic culture of America, and I thought it was very interesting how the media sort of translates that. Taking covers, for example, the shooting, and how the media covers only the bad guy. How would you have done a radio session on the covers of the news arms shooting to make it neutral like your style?
Wow. I don't even know how to answer that.
For the sign company.
Yeah. You have to, I think, I don't know, I actually don't know how to answer the question, but
No, just how would you have done it?
yeah. Yeah, you gotta push, don't you? Can't let the old guy off the hook, can you? Yeah. I'll get you. I think first of all, you start from the premise, what are the unanswered questions here? What don't we know that we need to find out about? What are people interested in, not interested in a voyeuristic way, but interested in learning more about a particular incident, you know? It may have something to do, maybe, you know, who is the goofball who was shooting all these people, but probably not too much of that. Maybe so, though. Maybe that's you know, where a lot of the unanswered questions are. You know, that would be the mission, to try to fill in the puzzle, to try to answer the questions that haven't been answered yet, and to raise some questions about some information that we think to be true, but aren't sure that it's true. I mean, you'll recall with the shootings in Connecticut, it turned out that there was a lot of information there that was reported early on that turned out to be hooey. And what, you know, unfortunately, a fair number of media outlets just started parroting whatever all the other ones were reporting. And nobody bothered to go back and say, well, no, that guy, he wasn't even there. He didn't do anything. Why are we dragging his name through the mud? You know, kind of thing. So I think a long way of saying, try to figure out what questions need to be answered, try to get the right guests on who might have the answer to those questions, and start in on a horribly delicate, difficult program to do. I mean, that'd be a tough one.
Well, to repeat the metaphor, we've had Gary on the hook now for an hour, and I think we can let him go. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.